Hi again. In the previous video, you heard from Dana Dimant some general commentary about disability in society and how it interacts with language. I think knowing about these issues is very important in general and especially for teachers. However, this is a literature course, so I want to think how these issues that Dana raised in the interview interact with literature. In order to do that, I will turn to the contemporary American poet Jim Ferris. We'll read an essay he wrote called The Enjambed Body, a Step Toward a Crippled Poetics. There's a lot to be said about this title, but first let's introduce Jim Ferris himself. Far from the only poet with a disability, he has especially made it the issue of disability, the issue of his different body, into his theme of the poetry and scholarly work. Maybe you notice that many of the contemporary writers that we study are also scholars or work at universities. As we can understand from the essay itself, Ferris has a condition where one leg is longer than the other, which impairs his mobility. As he tells us in the essay, throughout his childhood, doctors tried to fix this asymmetry, often through very painful procedures. Ferris is part of the disability rights movement and the field of disability studies. If we look at the title of the essay, we can start to see what he is trying to accomplish in this essay. So we're going to give the essay title a very close reading. Enjambed is a term from poetry. Ferris will remind us what it means later. It usually refers to the lines in poetry. But here he's talking about the enjambed body, not the enjambed line, as if the term known from Introduction to Poetry is relevant to understanding a body of a person, perhaps, or maybe he's saying that the poem is like a body. He's going to say both things. Bodies are important for anything we have to do with disability, because for mobility impaired people, the body is exactly where the disability lies. The fact that one leg is shorter than the other, the fact that the legs don't work, that there's a limb missing, it's an issue with the body. In fact, even for cognitive and mental disabilities, doctors, people in general often explain them through diagnostics that have to do with the physical body. Even if they talk about the impaired brain, they talk about something that's part of the body. The brain is part of the body. So whenever we have a discussion of disability, the body is going to come up a lot. The title continues, A Step Toward a Crippled Poetics. Essays and books are often titled this way or subtitled with towards something, suggesting that it is an attempt to build some greater understanding or theory, but perhaps not claiming to have solved everything. So it's a step in the right direction, but it's not the end of the journey. Here Ferris adds the word a step. So we often say toward a minor literature, but which is the title of the book we started this course with. Here he says a step toward. First, to emphasize that he is not promising a full theory, and secondly, because stepping on the foot is going to be crucial to what he tells us about his life and what he thinks about poetry. Remember, in poetry, a foot is a unit of meter, a unit of rhythm in the poetry. Thus, we reach the final part of the title, A Crippled Poetics. What's a crippled poetics? Poetics is the study of literature, especially of poetry, and how it functions. Maybe you have heard of Aristotle's Poetics, a book where he explains how tragedy works. Poets can have their own poetics, their own understanding of what poems are, what they should do, how they function, how they should function. Sometimes their poetics is implicit in the poems. Sometimes it's presented more directly in the poems in themselves. For instance, W.H. Auden, the British poet, wrote in a poem, "Poetry makes nothing happen," suggesting that in his poetics, poems do not have practical value. They make nothing happen. They have some kind of other use that's not really useful. Sometimes poets express and explain their poetics more explicitly in essays. They explain what they want poems to do in essays, in manifestos. Ferris does not promise a personal, individual poetics, but rather one that expresses a whole group. If you remember, we said that often minor writers find themselves needing to express their whole group. Here he steps into it very willingly. He's presenting not just Ferris's his poetics, he's presenting a crippled poetic, representing anybody who would want to recognize themselves as a cripple. Now, cripple is an offensive term. It's used for people with disabilities, especially those with mobility-related impairments. You shouldn't use the term in everyday conversation or in your academic writing because it's both offensive and very old-fashioned. Sometimes you can use it as an adjective when you're not talking about actual disabled people, but I would avoid this word overall. However, in disability activism and studies, there's been a limited reclaiming of the term cripple and creep as a self-designation. Taking this slur, taking this bad word back to the people who it's used against and making it their own as part of their identity, as part of saying, we don't care what you think about us, we care about expressing ourselves. It's a little bit like how black people can use the N-word to refer to one another, and how Jews can tell anti-Semitic jokes without being thought anti-Semitic, depending on the Jew. They take the slur and make it their own. So Ferris is offering it as a way to promise that the poetics that he's offering is representing something larger than himself, something that you can say in general about how people with disabilities write poetry. Will we buy it as something that represents all disabled people? Will all disabled people agree with what he's saying there? I'm not sure, but that's how he's presenting it. Or at least this is how he sees disability affecting his writing, and hopes that other people will see it in the same direction. Now, after spending 5 minutes on the title, we can start reading the essay itself. We'll read long parts of it with some commentary. Before going into it, I want to introduce the essay, say two things about the essay. First, it's quite fragmentary. That is to say, he goes back and forth from issues between discussing other people's writing, discussing his own life, presenting new ideas. It's not a well-structured academic paper. like the kind you will be expected to write as a seminar paper or the kinds of articles that you would read by academics. It's a more poetic personal essay. So don't, unless you're asked to write a creative essay, don't imitate his style. And also just be patient, and we'll try to follow the threads of his thoughts through his associations. Secondly, as I already said, this is a personal essay. He uses personal anecdotes and information from his own life to illustrate the point. He's talking about his own preferences. He's writing autobiographically, like we saw in a lot of minority writers' essays. Why? Maybe it's a little bit my own personal taste. I find autobiographical writing often more interesting than just dry theory. But also, there's this demand that when you write about the experience of a certain group, try to explain the experience of a certain group, what it's like to be an African American in the beginning of the 20th century, or it's like to be a Mexican American in the 70s and 80s, or what it's like to be a disabled poet. You sometimes are going to need to explain what your own experience is and where you're writing from. So a lot of these essays have a very strong autobiographical component, and this is the case here as well.